sharing Teams meeting recordings outside of CICA, but I will do my best to either put all the meeting recordings together or to produce some kind of transcript or frequently asked questions list afterwards. I just want to check, does anyone object to the meeting being recorded? Everyone comfortable? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so we're going to start today with a brief presentation, and then we're going to move into questions and answers. But I also want to say, please ask your questions as we go through the presentation. The benefit of today's session will be from the questions and from the answers that come up. I will also be asking you some questions. I think we've received a lot of comments and a lot of feedback, and that's been really helpful. But part of that is also understanding, is there an alternative solution? Is there something that we could do to make this work more easily for everyone involved in the process and in the transition? So I might be putting some of it back to you as well today. So yes, thank you for everyone who is here today. I've never had my video spotlighted by somebody else in a meeting before. I just want to check if I share my screen, if you're going to see me or my screen. So just give me a moment. I'm going to share the presentation and just let me know what you can see, and then we can sort out whatever the settings are that have been activated here.
You can see your slides, Tonia.
Okay, super. Thank you very much. That is perfect. Okay, great. So very briefly, let me just make sure that I can see what's going on in the session. Just give me a moment. I'm still allowing a few people in. Okay. All right. Okay. So very briefly, I think the biggest challenge that everyone is facing is grappling with understanding what we mean in terms of the shift from the current training program to CA 2025. And really the big difference is the focus in the assessment process. So I think there's a lot of confusion out there at the moment around the technical structure of the program. And I want to say what you're doing already is going to get you 99% of the way there. You're not going to stop exposing your trainees to the technical work in the way that you currently do in your training office. But what you do need to think about is whether the technical exposure is getting you to the level of development in terms of the behaviors and the abilities that we're wanting to see in CA 2025. So if you think about CA 2025, think about your current training program and think about the way that you develop your trainees. The focus in the assessment process is currently really just a checklist of technical competencies. What we're wanting to move towards is to say, yes, that's the way that you are training your trainees, but what we are actually developing is the underlying behavior or the underlying ability that the trainee is then able to apply in a variety of different contexts and in the new work that they're going to enter into once they leave the training contract. So you will have heard in previous sessions and in discussion around the competency framework that it's pitched at an entry-level CA. With the training program, we do develop both AGA's essay and CA's essay. So it does have to be pitched at a CA essay level in terms of behavior and ability. And then it's the other components of the qualification route that depend where the trainee lands up eventually, either at AGA or at CA essay. So just to make that clear, I think at this point right now, even though we're right at the start, I'd like to know if there are any burning questions that you want to make sure that we address today, and starting to think about some of the changes for CA 2025. Any questions up front?
Tonia, I guess it's you and I speaking. I just want to say from my side, the reason why I'm only joining today is because I want to have the benefit of your having had all the questions from all the other participants from the other sessions.
Yeah.
So if you could maybe just, if the questions do dry up later on, if you could just cover anything that we haven't asked by then from all the other people. But I don't have any pressing questions at this point, but I must also admit that I have not worked through the full document in terms of transitioning. So that's possibly also why I haven't got any questions at this point.
Okay. All right. No, that's super. Thank you very much. And absolutely, I'm sure also for those of you who have attended multiple sessions, you'll notice that there's slight differences. The presentation and the slides are the same, but we are, sorry, I'm just having a look here. I'm still seeing some questions and some, I'll get to the questions in the chat shortly. We are, oh, sorry, please just give me a moment. I'm just seeing a few people coming in. I think we'll all settle down shortly. I think the other sessions have also possibly informed what I'm going to say to you up front. So I might be preempting some of the questions simply by what I'm talking about currently. So I'm just, yes, thank you, Handy. You've asked a question around URBA. So we have presented to URBA at each stage of the process. We are setting up another meeting with them currently to discuss the detail of the assessment process, to make sure that what we have from a reporting perspective addresses their requirements. So absolutely, this will meet URBA's requirements, it will meet the reporting requirements. In fact, I think it might meet it better in some ways than our current processes, because we don't send any detail around assessment to them. And there is actually an underlying requirement in terms of URBA's accreditation criteria, where they do require a bit more detail. And I think having our own electronic assessment tool will also facilitate that process. So yes, absolutely, we're not going to let you fall short with URBA's requirements. Remember that CYCA also gets monitored by URBA, so we need to make sure that everything is, you know, above board and on track with what they require as well. Thanks for that question too. Okay, all right. So let me carry on then with the presentation. What I wanted to say up front, and Janae also alluded to this, you have already received a few documents, and I think really for many of you it's been a complete information overload, and you're not too sure where it is that you should be starting with the different documents. So today we're going to refer to two specific documents, which I'll show you afterwards. So in case you want to open them and just, you know, play around with them while we busy with the presentation and with our conversation, and you can see some more of the detail and perhaps start you know, conceptualizing it and also digesting it a bit better as you start playing around with it. So initially we issued 4 documents which were under the banner of the CA2025 competency framework, and that was sent out after the launch earlier in March. There was a preface document, document 1, a competency framework document, document 2, an academic program guidance document, document 3, and then document 4 is the one that relates to the training program. And you'll see in that document that what it really sets out is the overall structure that we're expecting of the training program, and it gives the details of the professional values, attitudes, and the enabling competencies that we want to develop through the training program. So a complete focus on professional competence. There is very little mention about the technical exposure in that document, which is why we then gave extra guidance towards the end of March, it came out on the 31st of March, around the actual range and depth of exposure. And the challenge at the moment is that every time we issue some guidance, it obviously raises some more questions. So we are very much in this transition with you. And already I can see that that document that we issued at the end of March has only taken us part way, and perhaps has also left some of you maybe more confused than you were before. So that's what I'd like to address today as well. What is still to come is more guidance around the exams, and having just had the APC results released, I'm sure it's very top of mind for everybody. What we also need to provide some guidance on is the link between the training program and APC and other elements as well. So that will come out. We did issue just a rough reconciliation document among some of the communication, which shows that as we were developing the CA2025 overall competency framework, the academic program, the training program, and the and the overall competency framework research group did engage at regular points during that process to make sure that the whole qualification route continues to hang together. The elements that still need to be plugged in, I want to say, into that process to make sure that we cover everything and that there are absolutely no gaps is the ITC, the professional program, and the APC. That research has already started, the working group's already working, but the physical documents have not come out, so that's why you haven't seen them yet. And then what we will continue to do is to keep bringing written guidance and continue with question and answer sessions such as this one, but we will also run proper facilitated sessions in the second half of the year so that you make sure that by the time you need to implement, you are comfortable with what the professional values, attitudes, and acumens would look like in practice in terms of how you develop them and also in terms of how you assess them. Guidance on what integrated exposure means, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well, and then specific guidance around assessment, both training in terms of how to assess in the new program and the electronic assessment tool and how to use that. Okay, so there will be a lot more coming this year. We are just where we are at this stage, and I want to just keep talking with you and making sure that everybody understands where we are right now. There have also been some questions around the transitional arrangements and the timing of implementation, and we have already communicated that we want to start transitioning into this new program from the 1st of January 2022. I think for everyone that feels very soon, and I know for me it also feels very soon. We're in the process currently of developing the electronic assessment tool, and there is still a lot of work that needs to happen between then and now. But what I want to say is that is a soft start to CA2025, and that really by the middle of next year, we want to be at the stage where we can bring all the trainees who should be on the program onto the program, and the others will continue on the current program. And in that light, I'd actually like a little bit of feedback from you. Some of the questions have been around, well, can this actually be done? Should we be bringing other trainees on? Should we just allow the trainees that are currently on the 2016 program just finish on the 2016 program, or does it make sense for them to come onto the new training program? So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a moment, and I'd like to get some feedback on that from you. What are your thoughts in terms of transition? Yes, please, go ahead. I think it's your hand that's up, yes.
Yes. Tonia, my concern is still, I mean, looking at all the documentation and stuff like that, and also speaking to some of our trainees and looking at sort of the way that they were trained so far, and then also the way that they've received their academic training is definitely not geared for this program yet, because I can already see that they're not making the connection with regards to the switch over of the competencies. I mean, we had a few discussions regarding even some of the basic ones that should be an easy switch over, and I think that a lot of trainees are just saying that they don't feel sort of prepared for this. So if we do have to switch, then obviously that will be the switch. But my honest concern is maybe that we give the guys at least that's on the program an opportunity to finish 2016 and then start afresh with all the new trainees on the new program. That's just my feedback from looking at all the documentation.
Okay, thanks, Hanley. Could I just also just get some clarity and just an example of what you were talking about? Are you talking about taking one of the new professional, so one of the values and attitudes or one of the acumens, and just taking what we're currently assessing in terms of professional skills And that transition, or are you talking about technical competencies and exposure?
I'm talking about the professional values, and I'm looking specifically also at things like your digital acumens and stuff like that. And I know that you guys previously said, you know, that there's going to be a lot of work and whatever. But I think in some instances, even sort of the language that are being used in the outcome itself, being presented that they need to comply with, is such a foreign concept to them, if I can put it to you that way, that they are saying, you know, how are we ever going to meet this requirement? So, like I said, I fully understand, and I'm fully on board with the process, but my concern is just, I mean, I spend hours every 6 months or whatever when I do evaluations, sitting with trainees to discuss, for example, you know, what is required in terms of that specific outcome, what type of evidence can you provide, those type of information. And if they don't even recognize what the outcome is that they should be meeting, you know, it just makes it so much more difficult.
Yeah.
So yes, if we do implement transitionally, we will have to do a lot of work, especially on some of those professional skills with regards to just translating it into a language that is more understandable to your first year trainees.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for that. So I'm taking a few things away from that. One is absolutely we need to think about transition, and just based on the feedback that we've been receiving, the conversations we've had so far, we're likely to head towards a firm set of these trainees must come on. I know that previously we've communicated that everyone with whose contract ends 31 December 2023 or later would come on. But it does depend on whether we're able to get everything ready in time. That still then only leaves 18 months. And it might be better to say all new trainees and adopt early if you'd like in your office. We encourage early adoption for trainees who have 24 months left on their training contracts, but we allow some leeway for transition. What we then need to take into account from SAICA's perspective is that trainees are going to be sitting on two different processes. And so there is a misalignment between the academic program, the training program, and potentially the exam. So that's where we really need to start asking questions. Is we don't want to set any trainees up for failure. So we need to make sure that we plug any gaps from that perspective and give sufficient guidance around that. The other thing that I wanted to say is that I completely agree with you. We are missing an element of guidance currently, which our training program working groups are working on, which is to say, these are the professional values and attitudes. And we spent months and months and months reworking the wording of those values and attitudes and the acumens to make sure that they were relevant for the training program. So if you look at the wording in the overall competency framework, when you look at the academic program, the wording is quite different when it comes to the training program. But I agree with you, there's still a layer of guidance into what does this actually look like in practice. So this is a lovely outcome that we're looking at, but what activities and what things am I actually going to be doing that evidence that? Similar to what we have on our current generic training plan, where you've got an outcome, you've got a skill that or a competency that the trainee is supposed to do, a task, but then in the training office, we also get into more detail. And there's some generic guidance that we will be able to provide from the working group side. And also for those of you who haven't been in one of these sessions before, just to let you know that we've split the training program working group to look at specifically officers that train through rotations and officers that train through client engagements. So audit practices, advisory practices, consulting firms, that kind of thing. And then those that train through rotations, and that is often our public sector officers in commerce and industry. So we are looking at the nuances between the different environments so that we provide relevant guidance for, environment-specific guidance. So Hanley, thank you very much. I did also send you an email to set up a separate session based on our previous conversations, because I would like to look at some of the detail, and maybe I can get some of the examples that you've worked with specifically with your trainees, and we can have a look at some of those specifically. But I'm absolutely taking the feedback that we need to think carefully about the transition and not setting trainees up for failure. And one of the other things that you raised in a previous session was also making sure that the academic program is not going to be implemented at the same time as the training program. We're going to have a mismatch, similar to how we've had mismatches before. But we need to make sure that there's sufficient guidance for trainees that are coming on who don't necessarily have all of the academic knowledge coming into the program. We already have that with 3, 4, and 5-year trainees. So we need to think carefully about that in terms of CA 2025. Thank you.
I have received your email, and I will respond. I've just been quite busy today.
No. It's sent it very recently.
Yes.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, good. Thanks, Handy. Joanne, you've got a question.
Yeah, Tonia, thanks. I think Gilbert has really summarized it very appropriately, and I see Faraz also sharing that concern. You know, Tonia, I can't even begin to explain to you the pressure that firms are currently under, from quality management standards, from new auditing standards, from staff, getting enough staff, from compliance, from COVID, from cash management, and I can carry on. And I am extremely concerned that implementing this for trainees starting on the 1st of January 2022 is going to be a rushed job. I don't believe it is worth it for us to implement a training program when we haven't got all our ducks in a row yet. And I'm concerned that even though you say now, and you also said at the launch, that you've got the working groups working on it. But remember that even when you issue the guidance documents, we don't get to actually start implementing the guidance at the get-go. So we're going to need, I want to say, actually 6 months plus before we can implement a program. So, and probably 6 months is even too little. So I really want to actually, almost want to say, beg you to consider if a 2023 is not going to be better. And I'll tell you why, because then you from Psychosine can have enough time to get all the guidance out by the end of this year. And we can start testing the waters, start trying out the stuff, start implementing, start getting our policies going. You know, I keep thinking about something which may or may not be in some other form a generic training plan. Every firm needs to go and think about the generic training plan and how that's going to be changed. And maybe we need more of these Q&As by the time we get to that point to say, okay, so this is what I'm thinking, that's what I'm thinking. And as much as you want to, you cannot actually chat to every single one of us or every network or something to really go and sort this out for us before the 1st of January, 2022. But then we rather sort ourselves out in 2022 and everybody is ready to go come, I don't know, say 1 October or something next year, and then you definitely know you can implement for your training starting from the 1st of January 2023.
And Janae, at that stage, if you've had that much time to work through it and to grapple through it, could that include an RPL process to bring the trainees on who have 24 months left?
Possibly. I think one would have to look at it, but I must tell you that I've recently been aware of a firm who implemented a SIPA, so professional accountant training program, and they didn't have their ducks in a row beforehand. And they had a lot of unhappiness with trainees, never mind management, who had to then obviously fix the stuff afterwards, but with trainees who were unhappy with the firm because the firm employed them, promising them a SIPA training contract, and then in their minds, or in their words, wasn't able to deliver on that. And I would hate for the firm or firms or SIPA to have that impression given to staff or to future CAs or to whatever you want to call them, to be upset about that. Rather take a little bit of extra time and make sure everybody has had enough time to implement before we just roll out. As fancy and as impressive and whatnot as this is, and even as important as it is going to be to get the guys onto this new program and teach them the new values and all those things, I'm all for that. Because I promise you, I would have loved to have taught those attributes to the guys last month already.
Yeah.
But the reality is that we're trying to run practices and we're trying to also pay these guys salaries, never mind service clients, or in whichever order you want to state those. And this is, as much as we want to train staff and need the staff and whatnot, this is not going to get the necessary, I don't want to call it attention, but we're not going to be able to roll this out with quality and with the emphasis that it needs if it's going to be a rush job.
Okay. Thank you for that. And again, I mean, I'm taking a few things away from this. I'm scribbling furiously, and I'll be copying all of the comments in the chat as well. What I am hearing is that it's not an objection to CA2025 as such, but it's such a big shift that for us to properly implement with quality in the way that we want it to be implemented, we need more time for that transition. So it's not that we don't stop, that it's not that we stop working now, it's not that we stop engaging, it's just that we need 18 months of engagement, perhaps, instead of the last 6 months that are available this year and the first 6 months next year. So I am hearing that. Thank you very much for that feedback. I just want to quickly go through, I see there's some frantic typing in the chat, so let's just have a look there. Farah, thank you. And I see a number of you have commented on the technical skills. I'm going to address that next. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to park those questions and then let me know if I haven't covered it sufficiently. Okay, Gilbert, thank you. You're supporting completing on the 2016 program, the existing trainees. Yes, Farah, that was what I was mentioning, is that there will be some overlap, and that's something that we also need to think about, I think, more carefully from SAICA's side. Just look at the APC results. There are so many unknown factors as to why the results they keep dropping as they have, and I don't believe that it is only one thing. I think we've all got ideas about what could be behind it or what could be factors that are impacting those results. And we want to make sure that we're not going to cause a greater problem by having a transitional phase that actually doesn't address, the current issues, and assist trainees to do better going forward. So absolutely, I hear that. Gilbert, I will come to the yes, I will come to the technical input. I just want to see if there's anything else here. Yeah, okay, so I'm hearing that we just need more time to do this. Some support there for what Janae said. Thank you. Okay, great. So let's get on to the questions around the technical exposure, because that might help a bit. So I said to you that I would show you which two documents I'm talking about. So just so that everybody's on the same page, I just want to show you the first one that I was referring to is document 4. Just hold on. Something has gone a bit wonky here on my screen. Can all of you see the PDF document? Guidance for the content development. Okay, so this is document 4 that I was referring to. So when you open the documents for the competency framework, please start with the ones specifically for the training program. And then if you want to, for wider interest and for background, refer to the other ones. But if you don't start with this one, it might leave you very confused. I know in the first round of comments that we received a lot of comments on the overall competency framework, and we had done quite a lot of work already to get the training program competencies separated. So please have a look at this one first. And then I just want to check with you, if I change to my other PDF tab, can you see a different document, or do I need to stop sharing and share again?
No, we can see. Thanks, Tonia.
Okay, so this transitioning from the 2016 to the CA2025 training program, this was our first guidance document around the structure and the exposure. And I appreciate that there are a lot of questions, and it has left some of you very confused, especially in terms of that very big table at the end where we've mapped the current training program to CA2025. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to keep this document here. I'm going to scroll. So please, if you get a bit woozy with scrolling on the screen, just close your eyes for a moment. I'm going to get to that that table. Okay, all right, so I'm going to start with the table on page 6. And what I want to say here is that our expectation is not that you cover every single competence on that list. I think somebody counted it for me. There's 270 competencies. That is absolutely not what we're expecting. What we are expecting is that you train trainees across the value creation chain. And what we wanted to do with this map that is here was actually to show you everything that you're already doing, not to show you all the gaps of the things that you're not doing. So if you could read it that way, please, and just note that, oh, sorry, somebody's in the lobby. Just give me a moment to get across there. So that was really what we were wanting to show you. Okay, now whoever was there isn't there anymore. I hope they got in. Okay. So when you read this, I want to just take an example of somebody who is on, if you're in office with an audit and assurance elective, you're 100% right, and I'm going to scroll very fast, so please just forgive me here, that the bulk of the audit and assurance competencies sit within category F. And so you'll see that all of the elective skills currently under the 2016 framework, you will find mapped to competencies in section F. Okay, but even if you're on an audit and assurance elective, you do other things with your trainees in your office. So for example, let's say that you have tax as a residual skill, okay, and you are getting trainees to prepare tax returns, etc., etc., you're going to find that some of that information is sitting in category E, for example. And also further up, some of the other things that you are doing, some of your other residual skills are sitting within the other buckets in terms of business activities, sitting within the first bucket around, sorry, here, more business activities. You can see there are more of the audit elective skills coming up over here. There's some more over there. So I've put in the framework, and I'm going to say it's a very loose mapping. We just wanted to give you something to start with, to start seeing how your current training program already covers a lot of what is required in the new training program. And you can see, for example, risk management and governance, the current competencies are covered, already cover some of the things that are required in the new competency framework. And again, I want to say that that's enough. So let me take a step back now and show you what I mean from training across the value creation chain. I'm not able to watch the chat in detail while I'm presenting. So if you want to interrupt me, please feel free to put on your mic and ask a question. Alternatively, I'll get back to the chat as soon as I'm done with the next slide. Just hold on a second, something's going on here. Just want to make sure we're sharing the right thing. Okay, can you see the PowerPoint presentation again?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, all right, thank you. All right, so what I previously mentioned is that the exposure will be in the technical competencies. What you'll be developing is what we refer to as the PVAAs. That's the professional values and attitudes, and the acumens or enabling competencies. And then you will assess the proficiency in the PVAAs, and from that determine whether the trainees require any other development. And it could be something specific to the PVAAs. Maybe you need to teach them a skill in order to get them there, or you need to give them exposure in a different area to enable that development. So the development question will be around how do we expose the trainees so that they have an opportunity to demonstrate this, but is there also something that needs specific attention around the PVAAs? So let me just talk about exposure. Okay. There is a picture which is in almost all of the documents, from the competency framework right across to the training program document, which is really the crux of what we want to say with the current training. Sorry, I've got another person coming in. Give me a moment. think somebody's let them in. Thank you very much. Okay, perfect. All right, so when we talk about range in the current training program, it's quite structured from SAICA's side. We expect you to cover some compulsory tasks, we expect you to cover some elective tasks, and we expect you to cover some residual skills. What we're saying with the new training program is that we want to move away from prescribing the detail of the tasks that you give to your trainees. We still, however, expect that you will train your trainees in your training environment. So if you're in audit practice, you're not going to start training your trainees in financial management. You're going to train them in your business, which is audit, okay? The shift in thinking is for the trainees to start to understand that it's not all about the reporting process. Within that is integrated an understanding of the business, what goes into the strategy and governance processes of a business, the decision making, the protections of capitals, as we call it, and then the outputs and the outcomes. You can see that in the inputs, the strategy and governance bucket is what's referred to as category A that was being asked about previously. And then categories B and C sit within the business activities, and reporting, compliance, assurance, and related services sit within the outputs and outcomes. Now, with time, the academic program is also going to shift in this direction. So they're going to move away from training in the 4 core disciplines. So they're no longer going to look at audit and assurance, accounting, tax, management accounting. They're going to look at it in a much more integrated manner right from the beginning, okay, to try and start right early on with the trainees to give them more of an integrated picture. Obviously, by the point that a student exits the academic program, they have to be integrating that. And when you look at the ITC, that is a completely integrated paper, and it does set the standard for them. But the way that the teaching is going to happen is going to shift so that it's starting to get integrated much earlier on in the academic program. In the training program, your exposure will give exposure across that value creation chain. So if you're finding that there are major gaps, then let's have a conversation about that. But when I looked at generic training plans, current generic training plans of officers, and compared them to the new competency framework, everybody touches on elements of the different buckets. And when I refer to buckets, what I'm talking about is the input bucket, the business activities bucket, and the outputs and outcomes bucket. And what we're looking for is that there is integration in the training between, so within a bucket. So when we're looking at governance, are we looking at governance holistically within an organization? When we're looking at a business activity, are we looking at it holistically? And then between the buckets, so when we are looking at audit and assurance and we're doing an audit engagement, surely we're wanting to understand something about the business activities, and surely we want to understand something about the governance of that organization. So it's training the trainee to think in an integrated manner. And if you look at some of the things that have come out of the APC, I'm going to say that again because it's so fresh in everybody's minds. One of the things that is lacking for many trainees is they're really good at the technical content, but they are lacking the integrated thinking or the critical thinking, and sometimes even the professional judgment that's required when they're actually answering those questions. And they're missing information because they're not thinking broadly enough. So that's really what we're wanting to get to here. Not that you're shifting your business model. This is your business model, how you actually operate as a training program. But it's to shift the thinking for the trainees to see it in a more integrated manner. So if you take, for example, your generic training plan, and you take one of the examples that is there currently, let's say you're doing the planning section of an audit, and I'm sorry, I'm referring a lot to audit, but I've noticed that there are a lot of audit training officers on the call today. If you look at let's say audit planning, there's going to be something in each one of those buckets that happens while the trainee is going through that process. And that's really what we want to start connecting the dots with, is to let the trainee think about, well, what am I actually doing here? I'm getting this, I'm getting that, I'm getting that, and then to map it to the requirements of the competency framework. a similar exercise to what many of you had to do when you did your CPD reflective plan for the first time. I'm sure you also looked at that massive list of competencies and thought, where do I start? Some of this really doesn't feel relevant to me. And that's right. Some of these are not going to be relevant for your training office environment. We want to step away from you giving exposure simply to meet CYCA's requirements, which I think does happen to some extent in the current program. There are many simulated activities that really, if CYCA didn't require it, you wouldn't be doing it with your trainees because they feel unnecessary and really just something that you're ticking off a checklist for CYCA's purposes. We want you to give meaningful exposure to your trainees that is relevant in terms of your business environment. So we're actually wanting this training program to give you more flexibility in terms of how you train your trainees. So I'm going to pause again at that stage. Yes, somebody jump in, please.
Tonia, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Please ask the question.
I just had a concern around, particularly at the input stage. Some of it feels a bit pie in the sky that we would allow our trainees to be involved in or develop PVAAs or enabling competencies in that sphere. Because it's even our existing CAs don't necessarily get that level of exposure. Yeah. So that was really a concern that we had in looking at this new framework. As amazing as it would be, it's just not practical. So now we actually gonna have to put more work in the system to enable them to have some kind of attachment or some kind of I wouldn't call it a simulation to give them that kind of exposure, but is that really what's wanted? Since based on what you explained now, it's more so that we can train trainees in a way that's conducive to how we run our business model and operation. So maybe you can give me a practical example of how that would happen, particularly in a commerce and industry environment. And in a massive corporate.
Farah, thank you very much for that question. Could I just maybe perhaps, so that I give you a relevant example, could you give me one of the competencies that you're talking about, and let's discuss that one? Because remember, we're talking here about exposure.
Yeah, I would need to open the document I don't have open at the moment.
No, that's fine. Do you want me to share it quickly? We can have a quick look.
Sure.
Just give me a moment. Sorry, I'm grappling with too many screens. Maybe my digital acumen needs a little bit of work here. Okay, all right. Okay, it should be shared. Can you see it?
Yes, I can see. And I see governance model. And if we move down to strategy. Yeah, business strategy. Strategy, development process. Like the bit about analyzing and aligning overall purposes feels a bit academic, feels a bit of an academic exercise, but we can take that.
So Farah, I think that's one of the things that I thank you for that example, because it's also prompted something else that I want to talk about. We're not expecting you to do everyone. Okay, so that's the first thing. I do want to just remind you that if this doesn't make sense in your environment,
I didn't know that.
Don't have to do it. No, so that's exactly what I'm saying. We want you to do some in the inputs bucket, some in the business activities bucket, and some in the outputs leading to outcomes bucket. But we're not expecting you to do all of them. We've given you all of them to say this is the range that you can work within. So perhaps in some organizations, the trainee will have an opportunity to get involved in the strategy process. They're not going to do it at expert level. They might do it at a very basic foundation level where they give some inputs into the process. They don't actually give advice. They don't do that part of that. But they have they have some link to that. And if we can show them that that's what they've been involved in, we're already starting to teach them about what that could look like one day when they get out there. Yours would probably be more focused on the governance, because that seemed to be something that was something you're probably already doing to some extent with your trainees. Perhaps with
governance would be highly relevant. Strategy would be less so.
Yeah, so then in your environment, you would focus on the governance as part of the input. And, you know, the trainees will have this long list available to them. So if they do at some point on a job or on a particular rotation happen to touch on something in that, they can put it down and they can say, this was the small example that I did that actually touched on this. So it gives them more of a sense of that integration. And also for you, you'll start, as we start evolving with this, you'll probably find that you want to use some of the other areas. But for now, start with what you've got and start with what makes sense right now in terms of your training environment. So I'm hoping that that's starting to get a little clearer.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway for me was that we don't have to do everything. I really honestly didn't know that, because I started to stress a bit when I looked at a lot of this, because I thought nobody's going to like me if I'm going to add, you know, this into the environment where people are actually needing to do more of an academic exercise than practical, you know, on the job exposure.
Yeah. And you'll notice that this list of technical competencies is identical to that in the overall competency framework. We did not change it. We left it exactly as is, because when the trainee leaves and they have to go and do more CPD and they have to look at that, this is the list that they're going to be presented with. It's the same list that we work off when we look at our CPD reflective plans. So, and they are pitched in a little bit more of an academic manner, the way that they're phrased. But it doesn't mean that you don't touch on it in the work that you're doing. So with the PVAAs, which we're actually assessing, we spent a lot of time making sure that they were phrased in a way that is more practically implemented, taking, of course, Hanli's point from earlier that we need to do more work in terms of that layer in between to explain, that's very nice, that's what it says, that's the outcome, but what does this actually look like in practice, and give some examples around that. When it comes to the technical competencies, we left the wording just as it is. And you might find that a trainee might do a portion of something here. They might not even do the whole thing. So let's just take this one here. So currently, assess the contextual influences on an organization's external, internal environment, etc., by using relevant strategic analysis tools, frameworks, and models. In the audit and assurance elective, and I'm sorry, now I'm moving away from commerce and industry again, but obtains a qualitative understanding of the entity and its environment and documents this information in an appropriate format is what the current task says, which touches on elements of what's in there, but it might not be the whole thing. And yet, maybe the trainee is using some of the other elements of that, and it's not captured in our current requirements. So it gives scope to increase what you're doing and to give more, I want to say, credit for what the trainees are doing. And at the same time, you don't have to do the elements that don't make sense for your environment. So the trainee might do a part, they might do it all. And when you're tracking the exposure, yes, the trainee will link it to a specific technical competence, but they'll also write a little bit about what it was that they actually did, so that you can start gauging the depth of the exposure that the trainee is getting as well.
I just have another comment. What's missing for me is, how do we know we are sufficiently developing the enabling and PVAAs? So our focus in terms of our plan is still around the technical, because we're still going to need to prescribe to various areas what the trainee is going to be doing in those rotations or audits, etc. But how do we know and feel comfortable that we are actually addressing the PVAAs and enabling competency?
Yeah, so I think that's where where this is going to probably be the challenge. So if you think back a few years, the assessment tools were actually drafted initially. The TSR, the Current Technical Skills Review, used to have a little block in there that said reflect on the professional skills that you displayed while you were doing this technical work. And really, that's what we're moving towards. You're probably going to find that the professional values, attitudes, and acumens can be trained across a number of different rotations. The rotations working group is going to come up with some examples of where they think it's more likely that trainees are going to get, for example, some of the digital acumens, or perhaps have an opportunity to look at some of the ethical values. But it should be open. So the trainees are able to, they do their work and they develop the abilities that underpin that. And so I want to say we don't want to give too much guidance because we don't want to limit it. We want trainees to start reflecting on the development of those abilities and the development of those behaviors. And at the same time, I think that there is place for some examples when we start showing how the professional values and attitudes could play out in practice. You're going to see that this is likely to happen when you are doing this rotation, or it's likely to happen when you're doing this section of an audit, or when you're consulting in this way with one of your clients. So I agree with you that there is more that needs to be done there. But if you go back to the little diagram that I showed earlier, and I just want to go back to that presentation, just give me a moment.
While you're doing that, I just want to emphasize that is so critically important, because at the moment, my trainees already struggle with translating the technical work they're doing to the current professional skills that they're needing to rate themselves on. You know, there's constant probing and trying to give them examples, trying to get them to think in a certain way. And now with, you know, increased emphasis on this, they're going to need psychos help and support in helping them, you know, because it's thinking in a certain way, you know, being able to be aware of a particular skill that you're honing. At the moment, they may not even be realizing they're developing that skill.
Exactly.
So they do need help and support with that.
So, gosh, just hold on. I'm trying to get this document in front of my face so that I can actually see it. There you go. Okay. All right. So let's just take a step back and think about how this will actually play out in progress, in practice. So the trainees being exposed, they're either on a rotation or their particular engagement, and they know what sections, for example, they're going to be doing, or what specific tasks that they're going to be doing in that area. Okay. So that's the exposure element. And then on a regular basis, we want them to reflect on what they are developing. So we're going to move away from a TSR and PSR, two separate documents, to a single learning outcome review, where on a regular basis, the trainee goes in and says, this is what I did technically on the job. Okay, and it maps it to a few of the technical competencies. But actually what I developed was the ability to do this. And the values that I was expressing and what I noticed in terms of my behavior is this, and that maps across to the professional values and attitudes. Now, you'll have noticed, for all of you, that there's been a lot of emphasis over the last few years, both from the reviewers, when they are the training office reviewers, when they go in and look at your assessment process, and also in terms of the training that we've done, the trainee assessment update, the reviewer update, the assessor training that we've been doing. Increasingly, we've placed emphasis on documenting evidence for the professional skills. And I think with the current program, there are many different limitations, but we still aren't quite where we need to be in terms of documenting professional skills. Some trainees do a brilliant job, but in other offices, I think sometimes you're at your wit's end, because you can train them and you're not getting to where you want to be. So I agree. It's one of the areas we have to upskill the assessors. We have to upskill the reviewers in the process. And a big component of getting everyone ready for this will be working with the trainees who are going to come onto this program, so that they understand the assessment process and how to reflect. So that reflective practice, I think for all of us, when we looked at our reflective plans for CPD for the first time, we weren't all sure what to do, you know, and I think there were many requests to SAICA to give templates and examples and what does this actually mean. And I think for all of us, we do reflect in different ways, but I think that's part of the shift in the training program and how we're going to get the trainees to think about things differently. We're going to prompt reflection more regularly, and we will give some guidance even within the electronic assessment tool to prompt them that when they document the evidence, have they considered these 5 factors? Have they been specific about the way that they've documented what they did? Have they brought in enough detail that the reviewer, who is effectively corroborating that evidence and saying, yes, we saw this happen in practice, is able to look at that evidence and say, yes, it's good enough. We can say this has been met. And that's one of the things that the working group has requested, is that in the electronic assessment tool, before the reviewer even goes into a process of rating a trainee, they're able to push it back to the trainee and say, you need to document better evidence because I can't work with what you've given me. Hanley, I remember a previous conversation from one of the other sessions as well, where you spoke about documenting of professional skill evidence. And I think that is so critical in terms of the new training program. So it's one of the areas you can start with now, is to start working with your trainees around documenting professional skill evidence. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions at this point, or can I continue with the presentation?
Tonia, if I may ask another question, please. I'm having a look at the depth of exposure, which refers to foundational, intermediate, and advanced. Yeah. And then I also had a look at the document that you had on earlier about the one that was sent with the launch, the document number 4. Yes. Which also mentions, but then it talks to the assessment of competence, also referring to foundational, intermediate, and advanced. And I'm already confused, because now I can see, if I get confused between the 3 different levels who have the same names, someone else is going to get confused as well. Yes. Are you going to change that, or can you explain the difference between these things for me? Because now I've got depth of exposure and I've got competency that refers to frequency and context, and yeah, it's going to cause confusion.
Yes, I completely agree with you. Give me a moment. I just want to get to that slide. And this is where we wanted to get some guidance out so that we could start prompting some thinking around it. But we definitely need to give more information on this. So if you take the competency framework, yes, they've got the proficiency levels, and because it's drafted as an overall competency framework, there's a proficiency level matrix for the professional values and attitudes, there's one for the enabling competencies, and there's a different one for the technical skills. Now, in drafting that guidance for the exposure in the training program, we brought in that matrix for technical competencies as a measure of depth. But it's also not the only measure of depth. This is just one element. If you think about how trainees grow and develop across the training program, yes, it's about exposure, and let's say advanced exposure. So we need to place them in complex scenarios, things that they can really grapple with so that they can develop that thinking that we're looking for, have to apply their professional judgment, have to develop relationships with other people so that they can integrate knowledge across the value creation chain. So we want to place them in that kind of scenario, and that's really what this matrix talks about. It talks about in-depth knowledge and rigorous understanding, applying the knowledge where it's unstructured. So, for example, they get dumped somewhere and they've got to find all of the information that's relevant and weed out the stuff that's not relevant so that they can get to the answer that they're looking for, and that they're actually able to come up with solutions and apply that. Okay, but that's only one element of it. If you think about the practicalities of training a trainee, you start them off with something more basic, and then there's some repetition that's involved. And then eventually they after spending time in a particular area and doing it again and again and again, they actually get to a particular depth. So I want to say that in terms of depth, this is missing a few elements. And that matrix was simply I want to say an indicator. So I want you to ignore advanced, intermediate, basic, foundational, intermediate, basic, whatever we call it, advanced, whatever we're calling it in that, and rather take out the wording within the matrix to see what depth is. And what the assessment tool will do in reflecting on the range and depth of exposure at an A&A stage, I don't know what that document's going to be called, it's not going to be called an A&A, but the 6-monthly review. You're going to reflect on the depth of exposure, but these are going to more be questions that you'll have to answer and just reflect on in terms of the overall exposure of the trainee. It's not going to be that for each one you're going to have to look at, was this advanced, was this intermediate, was it basic, and to apply it in this particular way. Where proficiency is going to come into play is for the professional values and attitudes and for the acumens. So those two matrices, those are the ones that you need to focus on. This one is just an indicator of depth. I hope that that clarifies.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just concerned that people are going to mix up the fact that those words are duplicated. But if we ignore those words in the depth of exposure, that should hopefully address it. Thanks.
Right. And again, listening to what was said earlier on, one of the things that we're going to be doing this year is a lot more information around assessment. And since we are still in the process of developing the electronic assessment tool, I'm not in a position yet to give you an example of what a learning outcome review will look like or what that 6-monthly review will look like. So we are talking in very abstract terms currently. But the assessment process will be focused on the 89 professional values, attitudes, and acumens, those two frameworks, those two matrices. And we've also had a lot of feedback that those two matrices in their raw form, if you just look at them in that guidance document, that document 4, it's, you know, currently we've got a decision tree and we've got a rating of 1, 2, 3, 4, advanced and basic, and that already feels, you know, relatively complex and meaty. And now we're working on a matrix with 5 different dimensions, and how's this all going to fit together? And I want to say that the tool will help facilitate that. And it's one of the things that we are also working on guidance around, so that we make sure that that comes across clearly. And part of the upskilling of the assessors and the reviewers and the trainees will be to make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of what proficiency means for the different PVAAs. Faisal, thank you. I see your hand up. Just give me one moment. The one other thing that I wanted to say is, please look carefully at the professional values and attitudes and acumens. And I'm just going to share that document again. Because not all skills are trained to the same level. So sorry, I'm just going to scroll quickly. Just give me a moment. I just want to get down to the acumens. Okay, so if we just take, okay, so I'm not on acumens yet, I'm on the values and attitudes, the professional values and attitudes. You can see that there is a level indicator next to each one of these, okay? Now, for many of the skills, we're training to a level 3. So currently in the training program, we train everything to a level 4. It's not the same in the new training program. Some are only trained to a proficiency level of 1 or 2, not all the way to 3. So you are looking at an intermediate or a basic or foundational level of application or displaying of that ability or that attitude, rather than an advanced level. And then anything that's beyond that is after entry-level CA. So these two happen to be 3. But if you just move down the levels, you can see under corporate citizenship, there's some that are only to an intermediate level, and that's the expectation. And there's some that are even only to a level 1. I think I've got 1 or 2 here in the acumen. So for example, here, if you look at innovation and creativity, empowering and developing others by acting as a role model, providing advice, support, and mentorship, that's a level 1 here. But when you look at teamwork or you look at management and leadership, that's where it's taken to another level. This is around the innovation and the creativity and how those are expressed in these 2 learning outcomes. So please also watch out for that. I think where some of the concern is, especially in the digital acumen, is the concern that it all needs to be at an advanced level. And you'll see that that's not the case. I'm just going to go down to digital acumen here. So computational thinking, which is really what underpins being able to work with data and digital devices, problem solving, that sort of thing, is required at an advanced level. But for example, data knowledge and strategy is at a level 2. Data analytics, yes, is at a level 3, but automation, new developments and protocols, level 2. Cybersecurity at a level 2, so not at expert level and definitely not even at advanced level. And then user competencies, which is effectively what trainees are already working with, and things that we're already doing in the training program, is at a level 3. So please also just watch out for that. It is a difference from the current training program. Faisal, your question.
Hi, Tonia. Just observation. You mentioned that upskilling of reviewers. And, our experience as small practice, that's been the biggest issue, the practical experience of the reviewers. It's easy for someone to come there and pick on small technical issues that cause you to get a rating of 3 or 4. But, from a practical aspect in terms of assessing your trainees, ensuring they're competent, my suggestion was, in terms of looking at reviewers, to look at the option of using, peers to perform reviews, because they've got the practical experience, and that's where my biggest concern is. It mustn't be a tick box approach. We need practical reviewers who have that experience. Just to comment on a suggestion there. Thanks.
Faisal, thank you for that. I think we're probably talking about two different things. When I was referring to reviewers, I was talking about the person within the organization that does the review. So currently the person who's the reviewer on the PSR or TSR, and who would be the corroborator of the evidence in the new learning outcome review. Whereas I think what you're talking about is our training office reviewers. Is that correct?
So that's correct, yeah.
Okay, no, that's fine. I think we're all aware that we need to make sure that we upskill for the new training program. As far as the experience of the reviewers, we are very careful to recruit people with significant practical experience. In fact, a lot of our reviewers were previously training officers or very involved in training programs. So I do take the feedback, and I think, perhaps if there are specific issues around what was spoken about on, for example, your training office visit, I'm always willing to engage around that. But I do think in terms of CA2025, I agree that upskilling needs to happen across the board. We do actually have some of our training office reviewers on the call this afternoon precisely for that reason, because I think this is relevant for everybody who works in this process. What I also think will happen is that once we're able to have our own electronic assessment tool and we're able to have more access to data in real time, it will also start shifting the way that we monitor training officers. So I think there will be an impact there. But I do take your point that we don't want to feel like it's, first of all, a checkbox exercise and that it's not practical to that environment that you're in. Similar to what we're saying here in terms of the technical exposure, we want to give it back to training officers to say, well, what makes most sense in terms of your training environment? And the review process will have to follow suit. We'll have to also be flexible and understand, and also from a, when understanding the environment well in terms of how we monitor and review. Something that I think we're already doing to a much greater degree than perhaps we did previously, but point taken. Thank you. Does anyone else have a question or comment at this point? I have not been watching the chat, so let me just go back there and see if anybody's added anything. Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you, Handy, for reminding me. That was a question that came out earlier as well. How will we know how much is enough? Okay. I want to say that you will know that it's enough if you're able to get your trainees to the proficiency level required in the professional values, attitudes, and acumens. And I want to say that your existing exposure is definitely going to take you most of the way there, but the measure will be in terms of how far can you take your trainees in terms of their training in ability and behavior. So that's where the big shift is going to be. And I know until we actually deal with the detail, it's a bit difficult to conceptualize that. Joanne, you've also got a question?
Tonia, I think firstly, you mentioned earlier the training and the upskilling of the assessors and the reviewers, and I think that's going to be critical and more so than reason for us to give time for the implementation of this.
Yeah.
I almost want to say simulated assessments or something where we can workshop so that everybody's on the same page of this. How you're practically going to do that, I don't know, with all the assessors and all the reviewers, but I almost want to, in my humble opinion, almost want to disagree or question your response now about how will we know if this is enough. Mm-hmm. I can train and I can train and I can train and I can give exposure and more and more and more exposure, mm-hmm. and I can train more and so on. At some point, I would have given more than my fair share of enough. And this person will still not have been developing or showing or demonstrating the necessary values and attitudes. So where or how will we know how to, when it is enough, despite, let's say, the instances where it's not happening?
Yeah. So how do you deal with that currently? Because I'm sure it's already happening. There are some trainees that are just not going to get to the final level of competence. What do you do currently?
So currently, I think to a large degree, a person can possibly demonstrate technical skills to a degree, not always, but to a degree, and get signed off without necessarily having all of those professional attitudes and things. So I'm very nervous about possibly not being able to sign off a person because they're not showing the analytical skills that's got so much more of a focus. I'm not saying I never expected it of a person, because I promise you I would have wanted them to show that. But I think it's going to become a bigger problem here. And yeah, so to me, that's just going to be, so the one side is, what do I put in place in my training program? And then on the other side is, how do I deal with a trainee that needs to be performance managed, or even worse than disciplined, or whatever it may be. And I think we just need to know when it's going to be enough from a training program, or, if I can use the old language, the genetic training program, and what activities we expose them to, what training, how far do I need to go to help this person, to teach them how to develop analytical skills. And at what point can I say, if you don't now go and try this yourself, well then, you know what, you're never going to get it.
Yeah. So, just if I think about that, and I think about even the current training program, that really is part of the development needs conversation. So similar to what you do now, you put an action plan in place, but if the trainee is not able to meet that, then you have the opportunity to say, we're going to cancel due to lack of competence. And that's not going to change. That power is still going to be there for the training officers. Yes, we do have an expectation that you give them the opportunity for development. But even currently, we see that officers will give the opportunity for development, and the trainee might not make that. On the flip side, though, if the opportunity is not being given, then it's not enough. And that's why we also currently are so strict in terms of development plans, because it really is key to the training program. You've got to develop your trainees. You've got to give them the opportunities. And unfortunately, I think it's a little bit like, how long is a piece of string? We aren't going to know 100% what this answer is until we are practically implementing. The same as in the current program. As we've grown over the years, new things have come up, new questions have been asked, and I think this is going to be an evolving process. So we're going through a revolution now, but it's going to continue to evolve. That's part of what the training program is meant to prepare trainees for. And as training officers, we're also going to have to work through that. And I want to say, even from an accreditation and monitoring perspective, we're also going to have to grapple with that. We've already done a lot to move towards a more principle-based approach. And I hear Faisal's point that maybe sometimes it doesn't feel that way. And we need to engage more with training officers to understand what's happening there then. But I don't think it's so vastly removed from what the current process is. It's the same conversations around development, but maybe with a different focus and more of an emphasis on professional skill. And it is the biggest complaint we get from industry is when trainees complete their training contracts, they get out there, and then the question is, well, how on earth did this person get discharged? Because they can't do, and it's never a technical skill. They never point to something technical. It will be something in terms of how they approach relationship building, or some way that they perhaps write, or they're able to talk through things or explain or problem solve. So it's always on the professional skills side that the concern arises when they get out into the market. So this is going to sound very harsh, but those trainees shouldn't be found competent. And I think we're going to have to work with that as we move into this new program. But thank you for the question. Every time we have these conversations, it just sparks another thought in terms of, okay, we need to talk more about that.
Thanks, Tonia. Now, I think also, if I can maybe just raise a point that I had a discussion with Mandy after the launch also, was for me personally, I sometimes feel unsure about how best it would be to guide a person through, I almost want to say, the basic elements of, analyzing certain things or developing analytical thinking skills or things like that. We don't necessarily have the time to go and figure out what are those basics. Many of us have picked up those skills along the way, or we were fortunate enough to pick that up through our schooling or through awesome courses that we've been exposed to. But we need to almost fast track the majority of the trainees that we get in our training program to get them to be competent in these things. And I think that it's going to require resources to be invested in giving trainees access to basic training of what is it that we mean when we want you to do this, or how do you go about analyzing, how do you go about thinking about this. And I almost want to say the majority of training officers, certainly a lot of audit firms, are not going to have the resources to invest themselves. And if SAICA can provide that kind of guidance, even as an assessor and a training officer, I think a lot of people will be keen to also participate in that, to see these are the kind of things that I can look for in the trainee, and also obviously remind them, listen, this is what you need to demonstrate, but also to just understand what to look for. Maybe that will also give us more power or more certainty to say, listen, buddy, you're not demonstrating this, and I'm not just going to sign you off for it. It's just a thought. It's definitely not the be all and end all, and definitely there is still coaching and those kind of things that need to happen on the job and in the office and by the training officer and by the managers and all of that. So I'm not, pushing away the responsibility on the training office, but I'm just saying that might possibly really help training officers and officers and the trainees, of course, in that regard.
So part of the guidance that we are coming up with when we look at the specific professional values, attitudes, and acumens is to say, okay, so what does this mean practically? And then, as one of the participants in our training program working group says, what does good look like? So that's really the question that we're asking here. If a trainee is doing this, what does that look like? So yes, that's absolutely something that we will give guidance on. And again, I think we'll keep growing that guidance. We're going to give something initially, and then as we grow with it, we'll be able to update it and to flesh it out. And the more that we see it in practice and the more input we get, we'll be able to keep growing that, I'm going to say, body of knowledge and guidance that we'll be able to use in the training program. So thank you for that. I've made a note as well. That guidance hopefully will come out relatively soon so that you can start reflecting on your training programs.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I just want to quickly look at the chat. So I've got a question here. As a follow-up, would there be a reaccreditation review? So thank you for that. What we're going to do is part of our work in the second part of this year. Once we have our written guidance in place and we're able to show you, so yes, we've spoken about something that looks like a generic training plan. What we're really referring to is an integrated exposure plan. So these are the activities that the trainee does. These are the different technical competencies that they map to. And then when in the training program would we be looking to do this with a trainee? When would they actually start working in this area? So that's the integrated exposure plan. And we will run facilitated sessions to make sure that training officers have all had a chance to think about their training program, so your training program, and then talk with some other training officers who are in a similar environment so that you can brainstorm some other ways of working with that. And I'm going to say even prior to that, we will do some demonstrations in terms of how to take your generic training plan currently and start moving it towards an integrated exposure plan. The integrated exposure plan will actually be uploaded into the electronic assessment tool, and it will form the basis of some of your development needs conversations. So it will give you some indicators, and I'm not saying cast in stone because things change, right? It's a plan up front and then things shift around. You plan the trainee on a different engagement or they have to go to a different rotation. So it's something that will evolve with the trainee. and I want to say it's trainee specific. It's not a generic training plan as such, but if one plan suits all of your trainees, you'll have the ability to upload one plan for all of them. And that will form the basis of the exposure conversation, just to check in that they're getting integrated exposure. And then there will be a proficiency level expectation. So similar to what we've got with expected levels of competence currently, which are linked to technical and professional skills. In this instance, those matrices, you'll be able to say, well, I expect trainees to be behaving in this particular way by second year, but by their third year, I expect these things to come out. A trainee who's on a 5-year training contract, I actually only expect these to start coming in at second year, maybe these only at fourth year. So you'll be able to map it out for your trainee, and that will also form the basis of the development needs conversation. You're falling behind in terms of proficiency. We need more attention here, maybe a little bit more exposure, or actually you're doing absolutely fine in this, and this is an area we don't need to be concerned about. And then just to answer Jason's question there, no, you will not be required to pay for Psycha's assessment tool. It's one of the reasons that we wanted to develop one tool. First of all, to make sure that there's consistency across all offices, but also to be able to give it to you to use. Because currently we're not able to enforce an electronic assessment tool because it is an additional cost for training officers. And it doesn't make sense for CA2025 that is so focused on digital acumen to have a manual assessment process. So no, it will be provided free of charge as part of being a Psycha training office. Okay, so we've definitely digressed a bit. I just want to check if there are any other questions before I kind of just bring everything together again. Questions, comments?
Tonia, could you maybe have a look at Gilbert's question? He says to clarify using the one that he posted just before 5 to 2, so at 13:53.
Yes. So that was precisely what I was also saying to Farah, is that if you work through it and that just doesn't make sense in your office, it's not something you're ever going to give a trainee to do. You don't have to look at that. I should have prepared that document in the other way. I should have put 2016 down first so that you saw how it mapped to the current process, and then it would feel like it makes more sense because you're starting with your existing generic training plan. So that's what I would say to you. Take your existing generic training plan, have a look at the competencies that it maps to, and then you'll start getting a sense of how you actually already train across the value creation chain. And then you don't necessarily need to bring in the other elements. I've given you that whole list though, because maybe there are things you're already doing in your training program, which you can map across that. Or there might be other things that you'd actually like to give to your trainees instead of some of the simulations that you're currently doing that you could do practically in your environment, and then you can map those across. So I hope that clarifies.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, okay.
Sonia?
Yes, who am I speaking to?
Charles speaking.
Yes, hi Charles.
Can I just ask a question around the assessment tool? So that will be provided sort of free of charge by Psycha. What happens when there's customizations in that tool? Let's say a training office needs certain things, to sort of, I don't want to say mimic the old way of doing it, but let's just say that's the way they've obviously brought their trainees on. That's the training they've provided. Would that cost then be a cost to the training office?
So, Charles, I don't think it's going to be customizable in some ways. So, for example, if the training office is integrating a performance management system with assessment, that's not going to be possible in this tool. But what we are allowing for is different iterations within a training program. So, for example, different A&A cycles, or where you have specific policies in place around how trainees are assessed. It's going to be customizable to a certain extent, but I want to say it's not even about it being customizable. You're going to be able to apply it in different ways depending on your environment. Perhaps what I would need to know is what kind of customization you're expecting. We do not want to mix performance and assessment. We want this to be pure Psycha assessment.
No, that's fine. I think I'm not really referring so much to customizing, but just the way in which we see certain things, certain reports we extract and that type of thing. I suppose we, we obviously sat with, I mean, we use LTS, and I mean, LTS was always available to make those customizations for us, where another training office wouldn't necessarily want reports a certain way. We'd want it in that way. And we want certain alerts to be set in a certain way, that type of thing. So maybe that's more the customizations I'm actually referring to.
So maybe what I could also ask you up front is, if you have anything that you'd particularly like to see in the tool, could you give it to me sooner rather than later? And then I can we can have the conversation with the developer. And if it can't be done, I can give you that feedback and maybe we can find a different way of doing it. But I think for a lot of that kind of thing, you could set how regularly you want an alert to come out. The different reports will grow, and part of the developers' thinking is that they want you to be able to generate your own reports and customize things yourself. I'm not quite sure how that works. I don't understand the technical side, but the idea is that you will be able to put information together as you would want it. And then there's obviously some of the information that Psycho requires, or for example, that Urban might require, that we would then need to be able to provide in a different format. So yes, that is part of the thinking.
Okay, maybe there's one last thing, and I think this is something that, we've obviously had some engagement with the SESCAT in the past, but they didn't have a timesheet functionality built into their standard product. Would that be built into what you guys are envisioning now for trainees to track their core hours and that type of thing?
So we have had this conversation, and what we find is that for most offices that bill clients, they tend to link the timesheet to the billing process. So the way that we had thought of bringing in the time aspect, first of all, was at an A&A level, similar to the tracking of core hours currently, but also in the learning outcome review, to be able to say these are the different tasks that we did, and to be able to put an hours element in there. But the thing is there that if the trainee doesn't rate themselves on some work, or they don't put in some work, it's not necessarily going to pull through. So it's not a timesheet function. It's more an indicator for you to use for development and that sort of thing. So yeah, is that something that would be crucial for you in terms of an assessment tool, or could we work around it?
Look, I suppose we could probably work around it, but I think we just had the luxury of having both those things integrated. And I mean, we don't bill our clients, we just have external clients. So most of the top programs, I suppose, would have that functionality built into the assessment tool. I think it would be nice to be able to do the assessment with the time allocations included, because obviously, like you say, there is that cross-referencing. So if you're spending 100 hours on accounting, let's say on a certain competency, you want to make sure that the ratings are coming through there as well. And you're not seeing just one item rated when you've spent, let's say, 2 weeks on a task.
Yes, so that element will be part of the learning outcome review. So we want you to be able to track time. The working group suggestion was that we put it at bucket level. So is this sitting in the inputs bucket? Is it sitting in the business activities bucket, or the learning or the outcomes bucket? But what I'm hearing you say is it actually might make more sense at either area level or learning outcome level. So this is how long it took me to do a tax return, or this is how long it took me to do this set of financials, or to make this decision, or to do this budget, as an example. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, maybe my question should be framed this way. Is there going to be some sort of hourly requirement for trainees on the CA2025 program? Well, like in the old way, they have the 3,600 hours over a 3-year training contract. Will that be a similar requirement then on CA2025, where you have to have a certain amount of core hours? I think I might have dismissed that somewhere.
So the core hours requirement isn't falling away, I want to say, yet. We don't know if that will happen at some point in the future. There have been lots of conversations around, should we not consider training differently completely? But I think there's already such a big shift. We don't want to change too many elements just yet. We just want to shift across to a new training program, let it settle a bit, and then we might start discovering that there are better ways to work with this. We've had questions around, could trainees go on block release? Could they spend 6 months at university and 6 months within the training contract? Could they do a 20-hour work week for people who training part-time and do their training contract over 6 years, for example? Could we focus completely on competence and forget about the core hours? So these are all questions that are out there, but they just keep raising more questions. I don't think we're at a point where we can answer that. But yes, there's definitely still a core hours requirement. And exactly as you said, the question has come up from our rotations working group that they want some element of time built in there. But it doesn't seem to be quite as fixed as a timesheet system compared to the clients, the training officers that build clients, where it's completely linked to the work that's done, and it's done to quite a great degree of detail. Yeah, so that's what I'm trying to grapple with. I do think it's worth having a conversation though, because maybe if I understand better about what you're using currently, we can have a look at whether what we're planning would match that, or whether we need to tweak something. It does need to make sense for 99% of the iterations that are out there.
Absolutely. But I'm happy to obviously send you something out of this meeting, and then, we can always touch on it later.
Thanks, Joel. I'm just making a note here as well. Janae, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I try not to take over, but I keep thinking of questions. So Charles' question about the time, I can think that it must be extremely useful for top training officers, but it also reminded me of a current requirement that we have in technical skills reviews, to say how many hours was spent on this engagement, on this project, on this rotation. And I always thought that was extremely useful for what I understood to be a guidance to the assessor or evaluator at A&A level, to see how much weight this job carries compared to another one, and not just the individual rating. But as far as I know, the Word versions of the A&A templates, and definitely the LTS versions, do not give me that number of hours. I almost want to say in my face. And it's always been a problem to me. So the guys go to the effort of saying how many days, I think it is, that they need to record they've spent on their job. Yet when it gets to an A&A, nobody even knows it exists. So if you look at that, please just make sure that when it gets monitored at a 6-monthly basis, that one can actually see that information.
Yeah. No, at 100%, that is the intention. So just to give you an idea of what we were thinking, was we want to be able to give that as an input, first of all, in terms of depth. As you're saying, it gives weight to that particular engagement. Typically, a very basic engagement tends to be shorter, but sometimes a basic engagement happens over a very long period of time. And just the fact that the trainee is looking at the entire engagement gives it more depth. So it increases the range, but it also gives them more depth in terms of understanding how they really get all that information together. So that weighting is important. And that's why we were thinking to introduce it at a slightly higher level within the learning outcome review. So not at, this is how long each one of these learning outcomes, how much time I spent on each one, but more to group those together, to say, well, in this area, we spent about 50 hours. In this particular area, we spent 20. In this area, we spent 30. And altogether, it was a 100-hour engagement, or a 100-hour rotation, or portion of a rotation, or portion of an engagement. But to give that input then into the 6-monthly review, so that you can get a holistic picture of the exposure in terms of hours, but also in terms of the range and the depth. So for me, they're all indicators. What we haven't built in is that those will then be added up to the 1,200 hours roughly per year, or 3,600 for a 3-year training contract. We wanted to use it more for an indicator from a development perspective. If you're saying that a timesheet process is essential, I think that for us might be a little bit of a challenge, because it starts muddying the issues a little bit. We're wanting to look at assessment rather than core hours, if that makes sense.
If I can maybe just jump in, and I suppose it's kind of got nothing to do with me because I'm not a top training office, but even though you want to do this as an assessment, I also personally, for me, want to have a one-stop shop where, as the training officer, I can look at this software kit and see, before I sign off Johnny, has he covered all the bases? And that includes for me then has he got his timesheet hours there? However way it gets to it. Okay, so I'm not necessarily personally from an audit firm hung up on the timesheet, but I want to have that kind of record there in an easy way. So it doesn't have to, I need to go pull Excel reports and do all kinds of funky things there. The ethics requirement needs to be able to be pulled in there in some funky, easy way. You know, it's got to be user friendly. And there's another thing that I always also need to go and think about before I can sign off the ANA. So any of those requirements that needs to be met before the training contract gets signed off, we need to be able to log those somewhere along the line. You know what the other one was, which is probably not relevant now, but maybe just an example for if something similar happens. Up until last year, the guys had to do an ethics program as part of the training contract. And there was never a place in LTS where I could log that the person has completed the ethics program. So every time before I did signed off the ANA, I had to first go back to my attendance register and go and see, did this person finish? I mean, that's almost a waste of my time. If I can log it somewhere in the assessment tool before I sign off this training contract to release it, log it, get it over and done with. I don't have to go think about it again.
So maybe just to address that, the obvious place for me to log any kind of training would be in that section in the ANA currently, and the ethics training component could be included there. But what we are planning with this tool is so that it prompts trainees to think about it when it actually happens, is to actually bring that element into the learning outcome review. So there's a place that says, what training did you attend and how did this impact your work? How did it play out on the job? So there's some reflection around how that actually integrates into their overall learning. And then that will pull through to the 6 monthly review. And then the summary is also available as you're saying now, so that you can get that snapshot before you do the discharge at the end of the contract. And remembering, of course, that the ethics training has now moved to a regular conversations around ethics or regular training around ethics. You'll be able to see sort of I'm going to say at the 12-monthly cycle, has this actually happened in this year? Has enough happened in this year? And that could even become part of the development plan around, you know, the ethical values and attitudes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, I know we're not discussing the assessment tool as such, but I really, really like the way that we started logging the professional conduct skills or values or whatever you want to call them in an accumulation manner rather than just the 6 monthly thing. But yeah, okay, I'll stop talking about the IT part now.
No, that's fine. And look, I think once we've got more to show you, we'll also be able to get more feedback, and you know, we can grow the process together. And you know, ultimately, it's only when you really start working, when you start using the tool, that it really starts to make sense, and we can start thinking about improvements and that sort of thing. But I am hoping that we will capture as much as possible of the input that we've already received, to make it as user-friendly as possible. And then Alzeta's asked about training. Absolutely, of course, yes, definitely. We will upskill you in terms of the assessment process and also give you training on the physical tool. We're also hoping that it is sufficiently intuitive that you can use the tool without too much difficulty, that it should be easy to navigate. Audrey's example was that, you know, nobody needs training on Facebook. So, you know, we are aiming towards that, but there will also be guides and manuals if the training needs to be reinforced, or you need to be able to grab some more information or understand how to do something. And we will also have resources available to help with end user support, questions that come up, bugs that happen, because they do from time to time, no matter how good the development is. So yeah, definitely that will be provided. So I am mindful that it is now 2:45, and we are probably going to have to start wrapping up quite soon. So I just want to take us back and just kind of bring together some of what we've discussed today. So I'm just going to share my screen again. Okay, so this is a very old picture. It's one of the first pictures that were developed to kind of visualize what the competency framework looked like. And I think it really has bearing for the training program, because the thing that's not mentioned in this picture is the detail around the technical competence. Really at the crux of this, at the center of this diagram, are the technical nuts and bolts, the things that you're actually doing in your office. But they're a little unnamed. So really this is up to your training environment and how you do things in your office. And then what you're really wanting to develop and to actually demonstrate and to grow in the trainee is the business acumen, the digital acumen, the relational acumen, and the decision-making acumen. And outside of that, the professional values and attitudes that really hold all of that together. And what does that actually mean is what we're bringing out of the training program. Trainees who enter the profession able to create sustainable value, to be responsible leaders, to contribute meaningfully to society, and to use financial and non-financial information. So that's really a snapshot of what we're wanting to do with the training program. But I thought it was quite a useful way to just bring together what we've discussed today. And then just briefly to remind you what we've discussed about the electronic assessment tool. The exposure will be tracked, so you will have a map of exposure that the trainee has gained over the course of the training program. And then you will assess the display of proficiency in the required behaviors and abilities. So that's what you'll actually be measuring, and you'll also be able to determine the development needs. And it really is a cyclical process because you give the exposure, you develop and measure, and it's really all about the underlying behaviors and abilities that you want to see in your trainees coming out of the program. And then if I can leave you with an absolute key takeaway today, is start with what you've got. I think the biggest fright that everyone got was they saw that massive list of competencies, which I recognize in hindsight, perhaps I didn't communicate clearly enough, was not meant to be what the new training program is supposed to expose the trainee to. Those are the overall competencies that once the trainee has come through the academic program, through the training program, through the professional program, written the 2 exams, holistically, that's what they develop. But in the training program, what you want to do is to give practical experience meaningful to your business, that the trainee can then start growing competence and demonstrating competence in the abilities and the behaviors that we actually want to develop. And when I say check for gaps, what I mean is in terms of what we're trying to do from a professional values and attitudes perspective, is there something that you need to tweak in the way that you provide exposure or get the trainee thinking about something so that they start reflecting better on their professional competence? And really, if you look at the current training program, focusing more on the professional skills and on the development plans, if you do more of that, you'll already start moving your trainees to where they need to be. And then I think this last slide is probably unnecessary because you've all got my details by now. But I just wanted to bring everything together. Are there any remaining questions? And I want to say for now, because obviously there are going to be more questions over the next few months and right into the program, and we'll keep talking and giving more guidance. But anything for now? Anything else you'd like to lay to rest today? Oh, Anita, you've asked a question. Yes, so we're going to build in an RPL process of some form within the tool. Now, because it's a psycho tool, what we want to make sure that we do maintain, and actually this is something that I thought about with Faisal's question about the training office reviewers as well, and whether they could have peer review. We want to make sure that there's confidentiality of information. You know that trainees put a lot of information into some of the assessment documents. There's client information, there's documentation of things that could be considered confidential. So we really want you as a training office to have control over the information that you have within your training office environment. So if we allow scores to come across to another training program, let's say the trainee leaves, goes to study full-time, comes back but goes to a different office, and they want to pull their information across, we will only be able to provide, I'm going to say, relatively basic information to allow some form of opening A&A. But I want to remind you that from an RPL perspective, you need to make sure that the trainee is actually at the level that you expect in your training program, especially if they've been out of it for a while, because things shift. You know that the expectations shift over time, and perhaps what they did was fine at that point, But in your training program, when they come in, you want to make sure that that proficiency level is right. So you'll have the ability to say yes or no, this trainee is not at this score, and create a final opening ANA that they can then use. I think that's what you're wanting to say, but you're saying from 2016 to 2025. So 2016 to 2025, you're going to have to do some form of RPL exercise. We also provided some guidance around the professional values and attitudes and how they map to the 2016 competencies. And you'll see that there's less of an overlap than in the technical exposure side. But there are perhaps some areas where the trainee did something that would actually count as evidence towards one of those competencies. So you would have to do some form of RPL exercise to see whether there was evidence that was relevant for the new program, and then you can bring it across. It is not like the 2010 program into 2016, where it was almost you could almost automate the process by questions. This didn't match, this did match. You can bring in the lowest score of these two combined. They're completely different. I'm saying completely different so that we really do think about a different program, but there might be evidence that's available within a technical skill or within a professional skill or something else that a trainee did that you'll be able to absorb into the new process. And that's why I'm saying there will have to be something that you do physically before you bring that trainee on from the 2016 program. Hoping that answers that. Thanks, Marika. Appreciate that. I'm glad that it's been informative. Please, if there are any other questions, I'm very happy to have more conversations. We will schedule more Q&A sessions. I think these have been very valuable. I'm hoping they've been as valuable for you as they have been for me. I think I've gained so much from the insight and the input from discussing this with different groups of training officers. So that's really fleshed out the system for me. And I will absolutely take to heart what you've said in terms of transition. I'll come back to you. We will think about this again. And yeah, come back to you with some proposals around how to take this forward. Anything else for today? Okay.
Tonia, I think maybe just not necessarily something for everybody, but I'm extremely passionate about having a tool tested properly by users before rollout. And so I sent you an email about it now as well, but can you please consider having people test the software?
Yes.
And invite, I almost want to say everybody or anybody, give us sufficient warning so that we can clear diaries for a day or two, and so that we can test it. It's going to give you guidance on what maybe still need polishing up in terms of the tool, maybe find some of the bugs, but also give you guidance on how user-friendly it is or isn't, and where you maybe don't need to give training or guidance, and where you do need to give more guidance on how to use the actual tool. So that we can just get that going before we start training the whole of psych, I almost want to say, in terms of how to use the tool, please.
No, definitely. I mean, the testing phase is something that's absolutely critical. And that's also why I wanted to allow a transition phase to make sure that everything is on board from when the tool is ready to actually when it starts getting implemented. We do need to iron out any kinks that are there. Yeah.
And again, you know, just not to have any mud on our face when we get trainees to start on the software, to know, so that everybody knows how to use it.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Tonia.
Thank you. Thanks for the input. I appreciate it. And I can see people are starting to leave the room. So thank you very much for your participation this afternoon. And yeah, we'll chat again soon. Thanks, everyone.